Sure. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Brandy Wood. I'm a senior environmental scientist at CDFW in Region 6. So it's the inland desert region. And our office is right in Ontario, but now with everyone, we're working from home. Um, so, so I wanted to sort of start very broadly and talk about the California Endangered Species Act. So just some background, it was enacted in 1970. Its purpose is to conserve and protect plant and animal species at the risk of extinction. And there's three main designations: endangered, threatened, and candidate. And a difference, and we're going to talk a little bit, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the difference between United States Fish and Wildlife Service and CDFW, is that under CISA, so the California Endangered Species Act, a candidate is protected as though it is listed. So it's during a review period, about a year, and those candidate species are fully protected under CISA. So CISA allows CDFW to authorize project proponents to take state-listed, threatened, endangered, or candidate species if certain conditions are met. And this is the primary way that we issue take authorization is through a 2081B or an incidental take permit. And the conditions are that take has to be incidental to an otherwise lawful activity. So you have to have all of your permits. If you're impacting waters of the state, you'll have to have a 1600 permit. You'll have to have water board permit and possibly United States Army Corps permit to do that. Issuance of a permit cannot jeopardize the continued existence of the species. So we won't issue a permit if that species will be wiped out by your project or will no longer be able to thrive with that project. Your impacts must be minimized and fully mitigated. And I think this is another distinction between U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and CDFW. So our criteria of full mitigation generally involves the permanent conservation through a conservation easement of quality habitat, enhancement of the habitat with permanent management and funding, adequate funding to do those management activities. So we do require full mitigation for project impacts. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a little bit more flexibility. Their mitigation standard is to the greatest extent practicable. So there is some more flexibility in their permitting standards. All measures must be capable of successful implementation. And so if you're going in and let's say you're proposing to do a type conversion of habitat, if it is a River City and alluvial fan sage scrub, which is all along our alluvial fan in the valley, and you decided that you're going to mitigate it by creating wetlands. Well, if there's not a natural water source, if there's not natural conditions that would allow that habitat to thrive there, it really doesn't seem practicable or that you're going to result in that successful implementation. So it has to be, we do have that requirement. And then again, adequate funding must be provided to implement all the measures of the ITP and monitor those compliance with and the effectiveness of those measures. So again, I'm going to probably talk a little bit more about the difference between CISA, which is the California Endangered Species Act, and ESA, the Federal Endangered Species Act. So there's, obviously two different agencies. CISA is regulated by CDFW, that's me, where the Endangered Species Act is primarily regulated by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. There's separate laws, federal and state laws. We have different issuance criteria and different take definitions. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service considers harassment as take. So oftentimes, and I'm gonna talk about least-billed Vireo and South-Western Willow Flycatcher, but in their take permits, they will also issue harassment take. And in that case, disturbance from noise adjacent to the project can be considered harassment. For California Endangered Species Act, it's really handling, killing, touching those animals. So it's more of a physical take. And then we have different mitigation standards, which I just talked about. Okay, so now we're getting to the fun part we're talking about some species and habitats in the inland desert region. And so overall, Region 6 not only has our San Bernardino Valley, we do Riverside, Imperial County, and then out into the Mojave Desert, up into Trona, Needles. So we have over 60 state threatened, endangered, and candidate species within Region 6, and nearing 1,000 special status species. And those special status species, I'm sure most of you are aware of: burrowing owl, South-Western pond turtle. And then these are two of our species. I'm going to talk about both of these: San Bernardino Kangaroo Rat, which is a newly candidate species under CISA, and Least-Bill's Vireo, which is an endangered species. So the first one, Least-Bill's Vireo. So it is both federally and state endangered. It's a small, mostly gray songbird. It breeds in Southern California down to Baja, Mexico. And so during the winter time, it migrates down south into Central America. It historically was abundant throughout California. So, but with riparian impacts, it has dramatically decreased. It is very musical and chatty. Males in particular can have up to 15 songs. So they're pretty obvious when you go out into the habitat, when you're looking for, in it, like mule fat scrub, riparian areas. It has a really sweet song. It cheetle cheetle chee. Anyway, so it's pretty obvious once you hear it. You catch on very quickly. So the Least-Bill's Vireo breeding habitat is this low, dense riparian vegetation. It's really a tangle of habitat to get through along water or intermittent streams. It can be in flood control basins. It can be in channels. Generally, it's mule fat scrub. It can be sandbar willow thickets where the sandbar willow is really close together, blackberry thickets, and out in the desert, it can be mesquite thickets. So I pulled this up from our California Natural Diversity Database, and these are the Vireo occurrences just throughout the valley. And so you can see it's quite occurring quite frequently throughout the valley, but it's mostly the Santa Ana River and the tributaries. Then you do get those little pockets of isolated occurrences, and generally they fall in areas where there's like a flood control facility. So some threats to Least-Bill's Vireo is obviously habitat loss from development, from flood control infrastructure, levees, channelization. Brown-headed cowbird parasitism is another one. And so you can see in the lower picture, that is a Vireo nest with 3 Vireo eggs. The white ones are the Vireo eggs, and then the brown speckled are cowbird eggs. And then the upper picture, the large hatchling, that is a cowbird hatchling. And then there's 2 Vireo hatchlings that the cowbird hatchling has crushed. But you can see how dramatically smaller the Vireo babies are. And then oftentimes, as a Vireo parent, you're seeing this robust baby that's so much bigger. And so the oftentimes the parents will feed the cowbird baby first, and so the Vireo babies are either not fed as much or they perish. So another threat to Least-Bill's Vireo is invasive plants in the riparian habitat. Arundinodonax has been a huge threat. I think there's a lot of management to get arundo out of the river, but what it does is it just outcompetes the native riparian habitat. And then recently there's been a new the polyphagus shot hole borer, which is also having a huge impact on the riparian habitat. It takes out the willows and cottonwoods, and so decreases the amount of nesting habitat in the river. So some ITP measures that we've been implementing is, I mean, the first that we would want is habitat avoidance, is, you know, just try to complete your project without impacting Vireo habitat. Seasonal avoidance, so as we discussed, Vireo migrate south during the winter time. So if you're able to do your impacts in the winter time, then we don't have to necessarily issue an ITP for that project. Avoidance buffers. So if you had to do a project within Vireo season, then around nests and territories, we would require that there be appropriate buffers. And again, you know, I was mentioning earlier that the male vireos, they sing constantly during breeding season. They establish territories based on singing. And so any kind of noise impacts that would cause either that male to have to defend his territory, or if they have fledglings that are following them around, and the fledglings aren't able to follow the parents because of the noise disturbance, it can be an impact to those birds. Vibrational minimization. So we've had projects where they're doing horizontal directional drilling or jack and boring. And so that the vibrational monitoring is important. We want to make sure that the nest isn't being shooken from the riparian habitat. Brown-headed cowbird trapping has been something that has been going on for many years. And I think there is, you know, eventually, you know, results that we're seeing, that a decrease in the brown-headed cowbird trapping. But at the same time, you know, just one more cowbird can impact, as we saw in the previous slide, least-bills vireo nests. Habitat restoration, invasive species management, again, going back and reducing the amount of invasive species in the river. And then overall, I think the preference is to get in perpetuity conservation. So having conservation lands being permanent is a priority for us. So South-Western Willow Flycatcher is another, and it's both federally and state endangered. It's a bird that's primarily in the Santa Ana River. It's a small bird with grayish green back and wings, has whitish throat, light gray olive breast, and pale yellow belly. They have a really cute song. It's a sneezy Fitzbue. So and when you're, for Vireo, you don't have to be permitted to go and do least-bills vireo surveys. For South-Western Willow Flycatcher, you do need to be permitted through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and CDFW to do this. They are territorial, similar to Vireo, and males will respond to a tape being played of the Fitzbue call. So they're migratory. They're present in breeding territories by mid-May. They have an average clutch size about 2 to 5 eggs. And then between August and September, they migrate back down either to Mexico, Central America, and the northern part of South America. So South-Western Willow Flycatcher breeding habitat is very similar to least-bills vireo habitat, with the exception that it really requires that perennial water. So breeding habitat includes relatively dense riparian shrub, tree and shrub communities associated with rivers, swamps, and other wetlands, including lakes and rivers, reservoirs. So you can see how thick this vegetation is where the nest is and how intertwined. This is the South-Western Willow Flycatcher critical habitat breeding grounds. And then for us, and we're going to focus over here, it's primarily within the Santa Ana River and the Mojave River. So very similar to least-bills vireo, they have threats, habitat loss, fragmentation, modification of breeding grounds, brown-headed cowbirds, again, invasive plant species, but even more so with water diversions, groundwater pumping, so taking away that perennial water, channelization, and then recreation. We're finding that recreation, particularly, I mean, it's very obvious within our period of COVID, people are getting out and recreating, but even before then, recreation impacts. Having trails into riparian habitats can cause significant effects to birds with those edge effects. So Southwestern Willow Flycatcher, when we're considering ITPs or incidental take permits from CDFW, the abundance is very low in Southern California. We do have some occurrences up in our northern part of our region, up in Inyo and Mono counties, but for generally in our area, Prado has some Southwestern Willow Flycatcher and then some in Mojave River. So we are not issuing ITPs as much as we're issuing for other species. The focus though is going to be on habitat avoidance, non-native plant removal, cowbird trapping, and habitat enhancement and restoration. And I didn't include it on this slide, but of course, in perpetuity conservation, where we can conserve the habitat forever, is a huge priority and a requirement for our ITP issuance. So this one, it falls a little bit out of the mosquito breeding habitat, but at the same time, it is all throughout the range of, I know, West Valley, and it can have areas where, particularly with nuisance flows, where we have some ponding water, but this is San Bernardino Kangaroo Rat. It is federally threatened under Endangered Species Act, the Federal Endangered Species Act. And just recently we have listed it, or it was petitioned to be listed, and we accepted it as a candidate CISA species. So we have, we're currently in our review process. There's a final review. It was due in February, but we're behind with COVID, so we're expecting it in August. But again, as a candidate species, it has full protection under CISA. So any kind of take for projects that may have occurred with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service now does require an incidental take permit for SBKR. And habitat is typically river sitting alluvial fan sage scrub in San Bernardino and Riverside counties. So the reason why we're, when we're talking about candidates and having it being listed overall, there's a population trend is declining, loss of habitat, flood control infrastructure. So when we put in levees and we're restricting the water flows to narrow channels, this stops that braiding. And SBKR in particular needs to have that alluvial fan braiding of habitat where the sand is being deposited and moving into those upper terraces. Population isolation, we're going to talk a little bit about, and low genetic diversity. So this was from the listing document that came to the petition. So CDFW regulates CISA, but overall, any kind of CISA listing is approved by the Fish and Game Commission, which is a separate entity from Fish and Wildlife. So some threats to California, to San Bernardino Kangaroo Rat is 95% of the historical range is lost. And you can see that peach color on this map. That was the approximate historic range of SBKR. And then if you look on the blue dots, those are the areas where SBKR has been trapped since 2009. And then the white dots are all of the locations where SBKR have been trapped historically. So generally, there's 3 population locations. There's the San Jacinto population, which is in Riverside County. There's this population is actually separated by two areas, and they are not able to mix together. There's the Santa Ana River population, and then the Cajon Lytle population. There's a large development that's being proposed within Lytle, and this area, and so this might be threatened.
Oops, Brandy, you got muted there for a second.
I did. I had to yell at my son because he brought his phone in. Sorry about that.
Understood.
He's doing his remote learning and he brought it in, and I was like, I can't deal with that. Sorry. So these are obviously isolated populations. They're not intermixing with each other. We have threats of potential development, some flood control activities, and then also non-native grasses can exclude SBKR from the habitat. So some ITP measures that we've been working on. So in the past, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, if a project was going through and going to impact SBKR, they would trap the animals and then just relocate them on the other side of an exclusion fence. And what we're wondering is, when you relocate the animals, are we just doubling that impact? So the animal is trapped and then moved into another animal's territory, and then they're immediately put into the fight or flight response. They have to immediately find a burrow for cover. They have to find a food source, and they're also competing with those animals that are already resident animals there. And then those resident animals are also competing for those resources with a new animal. So what we're looking at is doing a soft release, and you can see in this photo, we've created a hardware cloth cage. And this is just a temporary cage with an artificial burrow that's built in with a cardboard box and a cardboard tube that comes out. And we're also providing supplemental feeding. What we are hoping is that we establish this animal of, it doesn't have to go immediately into the fight or flight. It can get into this new habitat. What we've seen is we've done some remote camera work, and we've seen that the animals are interacting with those resident animals, and then it relax a little bit, and we continue the supplemental feeding in this area so that there's not that immediate competition. It has seemed to work. So we've done some small translocations where we're moving fairly small areas, and the animals have stayed. We have an experiment right now with the San Diego Zoo where we've taken Santa Ana animals and moved them down to San Jacinto. We're hoping that we'll do two things. We're going to look at, is this translocation effort successful? Is it something that's effective for the animals, or is it just something we do to make us feel good about, taking out the habitat? And then the other thing is, hopefully we'll get some genetic interchange where these animals have a little bit more diversity with their genetics. Interestingly, another thing that we found with our cameras is fencing. So generally we would require a permittee to fence an area and to exclude the small mammals. SBKR and kangaroo rats have very large hind limbs, but their front limbs are small. And so there was this idea that they wouldn't be able to scale this hardware cloth fencing, that the hind limbs were really, it's sort of funny, we think of them as Tyrannosaurus Rex, where they have a small hind limbs, but they're not really able to do much. But what we found with cameras is they're actually scaling these hardware cloth boxes, climbing upside down with their hind limbs or front limbs. And so they're quite able to scale hardware cloth fencing. We had a project in Highland where we use Animex fencing, which is white plastic fencing. It also reduces the amount of heat that's along that fence line and is absolutely not scalable by small mammals. So it's something, again, we're learning as we're writing these ITP measures. We're doing continuing monitoring after project impacts and then after translocation to see, are those animals staying, breeding. We had, I don't know if you guys are ever in Redlands and Highland, but the 210 freeway is right now doing an expansion on their bridge. And so we've translocated animals there. And then we have monthly traps to go look to see if those animals are still there. And then again, habitat conservation. So we use remote cameras. We're also transmittering SBKR so we can actually find them and to see, you know, are they surviving? Is there a response to the relocation or translocation? Are they, you know, just taking off, or are they staying fairly close? We can also look at interest-specific interactions. So we went and we not only transmitted the animals that were going to be translocated, but we also did the resident animals in the buffered areas so we could see if there was any shifts due to that. We placed ear tags, and you can see the orange ear tag on this picture. And we did both. So there's San Bernardino Kangaroo Rat, and then there's Dulzura Kangaroo Rat, which is not a sensitive species, but it does cohabitate that same habitat that SBKR uses. And so with the ear tags and the after project trapping, we can see if there's interspecific interactions between Dulzura and SBKR. Dulzura is a little bit bigger than SBKR. So, and then the last species I wanted to talk about, and it used to be more prevalent in our areas, but we don't have it as much, but it's good. I think it does occur occasionally in our area, is the tricolored blackbird. So this is a state threatened species. This went through emergency listing, and then the Fish and Game Commission did say that it was warranted for listing, and so we designated it as threatened. It breeds in large freshwater marshes, thickets of willows, blackberries, and wild rose, and it forages in grasslands and ag fields. It's distinctly different from the red-winged blackbirds that are very common in our area by the white band, a white band below the red patch. So the tricolored blackbird, again, historically through our area, this is another map that shows, this is from the CNDDB, and Wineville Basin used to have a breeding colony. It has not been seen since 1999, but it's something that, you know, especially in Chino, Corona areas, Ontario, it used to be, and you can see that white band below the red patch. So threats to tricolored blackbird, interestingly, they're highly social and obligate colonial nesters. So similar to the passenger pigeon that has now, you know, gone extinct, there's a positive relationship between the individual fitness, so an individual, and the population size or density. So they need to have a colony in order for that individual to survive. So again, you know, loss of breeding habitat, the conversion of wetlands into ag fields, particularly in Central California. But, you know, we're finding that the wetlands, the Prado wetlands are being encroached upon. There's areas where they were ag fields that are now being converted into development. The loss of foraging habitat, conflicts with agriculture, and predators. So there's very few ITPs for tricolored blackbirds because two things: there's not a lot of tricolored blackbirds in our area, and also they're not. It's easier to do it if they're migrating away. So one of the things that we're always looking for is permanent conservation of foraging and breeding habitat, just considering both of those habitats. And then statewide, we're working with landowners to avoid impacts. So if there's you know, and we completely understand that that, people need to eat. Ag fields are very important. And so if there's opportunities for us to create or to work with land partners to create wetlands adjacent to ag fields to draw those birds away from the ag field, so reducing that impact and that conflict, that's what we're working towards, and building relationships um, with landowners to avoid having those impacts between the two. So that's all I have for today. I mean, I'm very open to questions and discussion, so please. And I will.
Thank you very much, Brandy. We do have one question that came through. Where'd you go? There we go. This is one from Carol Ann. She asked, or have there been any least bells vireos spotted in Lytle Creek?
That's a really great question. So I would have to go back and look. So I don't know. Do you guys have access to the California Natural Diversity Database?
That's a great question.
Okay.
I don't know.
So it's really a great resource, and I could definitely look it up and provide that. So Lytle Creek, down maybe by Glen Helen, so there's been flood control activities that really impact the habitat, and so you're really looking for the mulefat scrub or the sandbar willow, arroyo willow habitat. Maybe up by the fire station there might be some suitable habitat that might have Vireo. I have not surveyed it, and I haven't looked at the CNDDB, but as a government agency, you guys would be able to get access to those. So there's two parts to the CNDDB. There's a government and public. There's a fee to have access to it, and I think you get like a monthly subscription password that you can go and look at maps, and then also you can base it on quads or species. And so it's really helpful. It would show you historical occurrences and current occurrences for species.
We have a lot of birders up here. That's why I ask. And
Okay.
So, it'd be good to alert them to this species in
Yes.
particular, since there's a possibility it might be up here, but it sounds like they need more of an area where the river kind of spreads out. And it's pretty heavily impacted with visitors. So
you would be surprised. So I, in my previous life, worked for San Bernardino County Flood Control District and Cucamonga Basin number 6 in the colonies. We went through and did a restoration project, and it is a basin and slopes. And just after a couple of years of our restoration activities, we had Vireo come into the mulefat. So they have a little bit more flexibility with their habitat. Then South-Western Willow Flycatcher is really habitat specific.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, any other questions coming through? Again, like I say, you can run through the chat, or if you want to just unmute and ask the question now, you're welcome to do so. Going once, going twice. Okay, well, Brandy, thank you so very much for taking the time and speaking with us today. I think it's really, really great thing that, I especially, have been working in vector control for 20 years and, don't know the difference between CDFW, DFW, all the different acronyms. So, this was very informative for me, and I greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, if there's ever in a time that you want to, I can, hopefully with COVID, you know, with vaccinations, we'll be getting back together, but I am more than willing to come out and give another presentation or talk. If you guys have a different subject or, you know, I'll look forward to
Absolutely. And can you mention that that website one more time?
The California Natural Diversity Database. And I can send you a link to it.
Yeah, that'd be terrific.
Okay, I will.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions or comments for Brandy, again, I want to thank you so much, and thank you everybody for participating. And like I say, yeah, hopefully we'll we'll get back to some normalcy here. And although, you know, this is a nice way to do it as well, because I think we get some greater participation of folks who sometimes aren't able to make it, but you know, of course, then you do have those weird interruptions and, and
yeah, sorry about that.
oh no, that's totally understandable. I know, I you know, with the kids doing all their remote learning, we've had some odd interactions as well. So, oh, can you do the bird call for us again?
Yeah, it's always my favorite. Yeah, chittle chittle chee.
Very good. All right. Well, with that,
Once-
thank you everybody for. Oh,
once you hear the Vireo, you'll never forget it, and it'll always like, oh, that's that bird. Yeah.
Yeah. What was the sneezy one? Can you do the sneezy one?
Oh, it's just Fitzview. But you know, like if you go, I think you guys go down Cucamonga Creek down by off of Hellman. Both of those birds have been seen there. So.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, definitely we'll keep an ear out for those calls.
Okay. Awesome.
All right. Thanks again, everyone. And like I say, everyone be safe.
Thank you.